What is going on, guys? I'm John Kelly, and today I'm going to tell you how I won $100,000 playing best ball fantasy football on Underdog Fantasy. And the best part is I'm going to tell you the exact strategies and methods that I used last season that are also applicable to this season, so we can use them for the upcoming football season as well. Let's get into it. So the first strategy we're going to talk about is stacking. And for those that don't know what stacking is, all that means is you're pairing your quarterback with one or more of his pass catching options. And the reason why this is important, especially in best ball format, is because best ball, you're taking the most points scored each week. So you want that ceiling, and stacking gives you that extra correlation, because if my quarterback has a big game, then likely one or more of his receivers or pass catching options has a big game as well. So for my team last season, I drafted Joe Burrow at quarterback and I stacked him with Jamar Chase, which obviously worked out great. Jamar Chase had a massive year, but so did Joe Burrow. And that brings me to the second point of stacking. Why it's so important is because really we're minimizing the amount of things that we have to get right. Football's hard enough to predict on a week-to-week basis, but if we come in with a thesis that we think Joe Burrow has a big year and we think Jamar Chase is the main beneficiary of Joe Burrow's big year, then obviously we'll want to stack those guys together. Now, ideally, I like to double stack or triple stack even, if that's possible. And of course, everybody is like, well, duh, we're stacking. This is 2022, like we've been stacking for years now. But let's be realistic here. Most people are still single stacking. Very small percentage of people are double stacking, triple stacking. Jack Miller of Establish the Run did an article, a deep dive on best ball. I'll be referencing some of his data that he found throughout. But 83% of people had a single stack, which is what my lineup had. But just 33.9% had a double stack on their team. And the number drops drastically to 6.1% of teams had two double stacks on their roster. So just because you think stacking's obvious, let's not forget that there could be a decent edge. As you can see, the advance rates for double stacks and so forth were towards the top of that based on last year's data. But going back to minimizing the amount of things we need to get right. So if we're coming in here thinking, hey, I'm going to draft Joe Burrow, I'm going to stack him with Jamar Chase or vice versa. Well, not only do we want to stack those guys, but the reason we're doing that is also because we don't need to invest any more draft capital towards quarterback for the most part, because we're saying Joe Burrow has a big year. We drafted him in like the 7th or 8th round. But Joe Burrow, if we're drafting him as our quarterback one and him and Jamar Chase is our primary stack, we're basically putting all our eggs in that basket anyway, saying they're both going to ball out this season. So I really don't need to spend a lot of draft capital at quarterback now, because I already know that Joe Burrow is basically going to fill those quarterback points every single week at a one deep position outside of his bye week. Which brings me to point number 2, and that's don't overspend on one deep position. So the one deep positions are going to be quarterback and tight end. And obviously tight end, you can double as a flex, but let's be honest, tight end is so disgusting most years that it'd be pretty hard to find not only a high scoring tight end each week, but also have another tight end be that flex point. If your roster's that weak, you're probably not going to have a chance to win it anyway, let's be honest. So don't overspend at these one deep positions. So going back to our thesis on Joe Burrow, stacking him with Jamar Chase, we already know we have quarterback figured out. So I'm not really going to spend too much on a quarterback, and that goes for tight end as well. This team that I drafted last season had Mark Andrews at tight end, so I was already invested in that mid-round tight end to where I'm not going to spend another premium pick at tight end because I'm expecting Mark Andrews to fill that week for the most part. So I ended up drafting Mark Andrews. I went ahead and took Dan Arnold really late in the draft, but it was really Mark Andrews. You know, he was on like 60% of the teams that advanced to the championship rounds last season. So going back to what we talked about, if we're already banking on these one deep positions having a big year, don't waste a pick. You see it all the time with these rosters that already have a premium tight end or a premium quarterback, and for whatever reason, they're spending another early to mid draft pick at that same position. As you can see on my team, I had the Joe Burrow. I did end up taking Cam Newton late and Derek Carr super late as well. In hindsight, this was probably a mistake. I probably only needed one of these, but ideally, I would probably want to use that at another position, just basically trying to identify a spike week somewhere else because I was already banking on Joe Burrow. So really that was probably a mistake. Don't be afraid to just go too deep at these one deep positions just because we are just banking on our premium picks using their points each and every week at that position. Which brings me to point number 3. It's going to be to prioritize your wide receivers. In my opinion, wide receiver is the most important position in these best ball drafts. As you can see on my team that did well last season, I drafted 9 wide receivers. And the reason why I do that is because on a week-to-week basis, outside of the elite tier at wide receiver, it could be a little bit volatile. So I want as much upside and probably most of my draft picks allocated to the wide receiver position, because we have to use 3 top scoring wide receivers each week, along with the possibility of having a 4th one fill that flex spot as well. And going back to Jack Miller's deep dive on last season's data, some of the best advance rates and top 1% teams drafted 2 to 3 wide receivers earlier in their draft, and most of them had the most wide receivers, more wide receivers than any other position on their team. And that just makes sense. For me personally, obviously it matters who and what caliber of wide receiver players you have on your team, but 8 or 9 wide receivers tends to be the sweet spot for me. I think that's probably just the best roster combination. So I'm really looking to scoop up as many of the elite wide receivers as I can get, while also not completely ignoring the running back position. Typically, I like to grab an elite running back in the first couple rounds and then really don't take a second running back until the later rounds. And then in the later rounds, I'm just nabbing up just pure upside at running back. I want 4 or 5 just high upside, situational upside, which we'll talk about later in another point. Which brings us to point number 4. Ignore all the off-season clickbait. And what I mean by that is you'll see all over Twitter, people are bored in these months leading up to the preseason, where you're going to see a bunch of beat reporters tweeting all these updates saying so-and-so is in the best shape of his life, running back taking snaps at wide receiver, they're going to line him up all over the field. Remember going into last season and into the preseason, Jamar Chase allegedly just completely forgot how to play football. He couldn't catch. He was struggling with drops a little bit, but apparently he had this interview where he said, like, the NFL ball is a little bit different. It's harder to pick up than the college ball, harder to catch than the college ball. So this just basically was all the buzz, was Jamar Chase couldn't catch a football. The Monstars stole his talent. He forgot how to play, yada, yada, yada. And most of us thought that was pretty funny. But there were people that seriously stopped drafting him because his ADP fell to as low as, I was scooping him in the 7th round regularly last season. And that's why if you're going to be good at this, then you need to be taking advantage of those ADP fluctuations. And a lot of that is driven by this offseason clickbait and this offseason hype, whether it's positive or in this case of Jamar Chase, it was negative. So I was already heavily invested in the Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase Bengals stacks. I believe in Jamar Chase. If you zoom out, you know that he was an ultra talent in college who, even if he sucks at the NFL level, we know he's going to get opportunities, right? We know he's going to see a ton of volume. Try to zoom out and take things for what they're worth, because most of this stuff is just coach speak and beat reporters just trying to find something to write about. Ignore all that other stuff. Stay focused on your draft and draft for upside, which is point number 5. Draft for upside. And of course, you say draft for upside. Well, duh, I think this player is going to outperform his ADP. I think he has upside on that pick. Well, that's not all that I'm talking about. Yes, that's great. Obviously, every pick that we make, we think they're going to outperform or at least meet expectations. But what I mean by drafting for upside is kind of what I did at running back on this past season. So I'm talking about situational upside. If something were to break right for that player, then he could really boom. And there's a couple examples of that. So at running back, I drafted Najee Harris, I believe in the 2nd round in this draft. I didn't take another running back until the 7th or 8th round, which was when I drafted A.J. Dillon, took Leonard Fournette, I think in the 9th round, and then got James Conner in the 10th or 11th. And all of these guys, in my opinion, had situational upside. But in terms of A.J. Dillon, obviously, we know Aaron Jones is the guy, but we also know that A.J. Dillon was going to have standalone value as it was. And if things broke right, Aaron Jones were to miss a game, or if Aaron Jones were to get hurt, then instantly A.J. Dillon becomes an RB1. So I'm just drafting for that upside. Yes, he might be able to fill in a week or two, even with Jones there, but ultimately I'm hoping that things break right for him and he becomes the guy. And then on the flip side, for Leonard Fournette, going into the season, Leonard Fournette was not a respected pick in fantasy. Like, he was going 9th, 10th round. He was in a projected split with Ronald Jones. Obviously, he ended up being the number one guy there, outperformed Ronald Jones all season, finished as a top 5 fantasy back. But that's another situation where it's like there was kind of cloudiness coming into the season. If Leonard Fournette becomes that guy, he's going to be the RB1 in a very, very strong offense led by Tom Brady that's likely going to put up a ton of touchdowns. So I'm taking that risk saying, hey, I don't want to draft them both on this team because I'm just drafting as if I'm making the right choice. So I'm going to say Leonard Fournette outproduces Ronald Jones, becomes that guy. I'm going to take the chance on Leonard Fournette here. And then the last example of that is James Conner in Arizona. Chase Edmonds was allegedly going to be the workhorse back. James Conner was coming off a year in Pittsburgh where he missed a bunch of times. You know, everybody just thought, oh, James Conner, he's hurt all the time. He's not that good, whatever. Well, we at least knew James Conner allegedly was going to be the red zone back. So again, similar to A.J. Dillon, he would likely have standalone value. And then if Chase Edmonds, who's a guy historically, we don't know if he can handle a featured back workload, if he's going to miss any time, James Conner is then the guy, and in an RB1 in a strong, high-producing offense. So again, it just comes down to where you're drafting these guys, but also you need to be factoring in the situational upside. Which brings us to point number 6, which is gonna be pay attention to the schedule, and not just the regular season schedule, because let's be honest, who really cares about that? But in terms of the best ball tournament, we want to know the weeks that matter, which is 15, 16, and ultimately 17, where all the money is. And I know there's been a lot of debate recently on, oh, how can we predict this? And oh, week 17, blah, 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 that doesn't matter. But let's be honest, that's where the money is. We want to give ourselves the best chance to win. It's hard enough to predict these outcomes at all. Any minor edge, whether you think it matters or not, any type of extra correlation, I'm going to take the shot there, because the downside is there is no downside. Like, if we're wrong, then we're wrong. It doesn't help us. But if we're right, then it does help us. And only a percentage of people are building their teams in that format. So 15, 16, and 17 are the playoff weeks in best ball, the ones where we need to advance to the final round, with 17 being the championship round. Last season, everybody had that big week 17 game circle between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Cincinnati Bengals. That's championship week. And guess what? My primary stack, Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, balled out that week. And it was easy to see that that was going to be a shootout type of script, even coming into the season. And it ended up being that Jamar Chase balled out for 50 points in that week. Now, that obviously always isn't going to happen, but it could. And that's why I think we need to start factoring in these things. Again, Deebo Samuel, the San Francisco 49ers were another team that we knew had a very favorable stretch of games last season during the best ball playoff weeks. So coming into this season, a few of those teams that stick out to me this year are the Jacksonville Jaguars, Kansas City Chiefs, the Tampa Bay Bucks, Buffalo Bills, and there's a few more as well. That's just a few that stick out to me, but it's very important to be thinking about who plays who down the stretch in the most important weeks that matter. The best part is, for this upcoming season, the contests have just gotten even bigger. Underdog Fantasy just released the Best Ball Mania 3 recently, which has a $10 million prize pool with $2 million to first place, $1 million to second place, $1 million to the highest regular scoring team of the entire regular season as well. Tons of money. You have to get in on it, and you can use my promo code John Kelly. I'll link it in the description below. If you haven't signed up yet, use John Kelly promo code. You will get 100% deposit match up to $100. So if you deposit $100 for 4 underdog teams in the Best Ball Mania 3, you will get 4 free teams in the Best Ball Mania 3 on Underdog using promo code John Kelly. And obviously, even using these strategies that can make you better than the average player, you still have to get incredibly lucky in best ball to get to that point. And that's what it was like for me last season. I had one team across the Best Ball Mania big $25 tournament and the Puppy tournament, the $5 one that I had 50 teams in. Just one team combined made it to the championship week. I had Najee Harris. As you can see, I was sitting in 16th place going into that Monday night game, but nobody above me had Najee Harris. I knew if he had a big game, I had a chance to get something decent. So going into that game, the vibes were high. I wasn't expecting a ton. And then this happened.
Najee Harris to the end zone. Touchdown, Steelers!
So that's how I did it last season. I think all those strategies are applicable for this season as well. Best of luck, and I'll see you in those streets.